June 6, 1944. The English Channel churned beneath a grey, restless sky, and along the northern coast of France, the wind carried the sharp tang of salt and the distant rumble of something that sounded almost like thunder. In a concrete bunker overlooking the beaches of Normandy, General Friedrich Dollmann stood at the observation window, coffee cup in hand, watching the whitecaps roll toward the shore. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because of any particular alarm, but because sleep had become elusive for men in his position. The weather forecast had promised storms for days, and every military expert agreed that no invasion fleet could possibly cross the Channel under such conditions. The tides were wrong. The moon was wrong. Everything was wrong for an amphibious assault. Dollmann permitted himself a thin smile and turned to his aide. "They will never land on these beaches," he said, with the confidence of a man who had studied every tactical manual ever written. "The Allies would need perfect conditions, and nature herself has sided with us." Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Within 24 hours, Friedrich Dollmann's certainty would crumble, along with the elaborate defensive network he had helped construct. What was about to unfold would become the largest amphibious operation in human history, a feat of logistics, deception, and sheer human determination that would reshape the entire conflict in Europe. This is the story of how one of the most heavily fortified coastlines ever built was breached by ordinary men doing extraordinary things, and how the generals who swore it could never happen watched in disbelief as their assumptions collapsed before their eyes. The defensive system along the French coast had been under construction for nearly 4 years. By the spring of 1944. What the German High Command called the Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, a network of bunkers, artillery positions, beach obstacles, and minefields designed to make any invasion attempt impossibly costly. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to inspect and improve these defenses in late 1943, had thrown himself into the task with characteristic energy. He understood something that many of his colleagues did not. The decisive moment of any invasion would come in the first hours, not the first days. "The first 24 hours will be decisive," Rommel wrote to his wife Lucy in January of that year. "For the Allies, as well as for us, it will be the longest day." Rommel had traveled thousands of kilometers along the coast, personally inspecting every sector, demanding improvements that his engineers considered excessive. He ordered millions of mines planted on the beaches and in the waters offshore. He designed obstacles made of steel and wood, angled to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. He flooded low-lying areas behind the beaches to trap paratroopers. Most controversially, he wanted the armored divisions positioned directly behind the beaches, ready to counterattack within hours of any landing. This last demand brought him into direct conflict with the overall theater commander, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who preferred to hold the armor in reserve further inland, waiting to see where the main Allied thrust would come before committing his precious tanks. The disagreement was never fully resolved. The supreme leadership in Berlin, always suspicious of delegating too much authority, split the difference in the worst possible way. Some armored units went to Rommel, others stayed with Rundstedt, and the most powerful divisions remained under direct control from Berlin itself. This meant that on the morning of June 6th, when every hour would count, precious time would be lost requesting permission to move forces that should have been racing toward the beaches. Meanwhile, across the Channel, an army unlike anything the world had ever seen was gathering in southern England. Operation Overlord, as the invasion was codenamed, had been years in the planning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American officer chosen to command this multinational force, carried the weight of the entire Allied cause on his shoulders. He had under his command nearly 3 million men from a dozen nations, along with more than 11,000 aircraft and nearly 7,000 naval vessels. The logistical achievement of simply assembling this force, feeding it, arming it, and preparing it for the most dangerous military operation imaginable, represented an industrial and organizational triumph that dwarfed anything attempted before in human history. Sergeant Thomas Mulligan of the 29th Infantry Division had been in England for 18 months by the time June arrived. He was 23 years old, originally from a small town in Virginia, and he had spent more time training for this invasion than he had spent in high school. "We must have practiced landing on beaches 50 times, he wrote to his mother in a letter that would not be mailed until after the operation. Every time something went wrong, boats capsized, men got lost, equipment sank. The officers kept telling us that when the real day came, everything would be different, but I think they were just hoping as much as the rest of us." Mulligan's regiment was assigned to a sector of the Normandy coast that the planners had designated Omaha Beach. It was considered one of the more challenging objectives because of the high bluffs overlooking the sand, but intelligence assessments suggested that the German defenses there were manned by second-rate troops, men too old or too young or too demoralized to put up serious resistance. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. In the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, about 15 kilometers inland from the beaches, a French farmer named Marcel Levesque was tending to his cows on the evening of June 5th when he noticed unusual activity in the sky. Aircraft had been passing overhead for months, of course, on their way to targets deeper in occupied Europe. But tonight, the sound was different, deeper and more sustained, like a continuous roll of distant drums. Marcel looked up and saw shapes descending through the darkness, white mushrooms of silk catching the faint moonlight. For a moment, he could not understand what he was seeing. Then realization struck him like a physical blow. Paratroopers. The invasion was beginning. The airborne assault was designed to secure key bridges and road junctions behind the beaches, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast during the critical first hours. More than 23,000 paratroopers from American and British divisions jumped into the darkness that night, many of them landing far from their intended drop zones. The confusion was immediate and profound. Men found themselves alone in flooded fields, unable to see more than a few meters in any direction, uncertain whether the figures moving toward them were friends or foes. They had been issued small metal devices called crickets, which made a clicking sound when squeezed. 1 click was the challenge, 2 clicks the response. In the chaos of that night, the simple sound of a cricket became the difference between safety and peril. Private James Dolan of the 82nd Airborne Division landed in a tree on the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église. His parachute tangled hopelessly in the branches. From his elevated position, he watched the town below come alive with alarm. Church bells began to ring. Figures ran through the streets with flashlights. A building near the town square was on fire, and its glow illuminated other paratroopers drifting down into the chaos. Dolan struggled with his harness for what felt like hours before finally cutting himself free and dropping to the ground. He spent the rest of the night hiding in a hedgerow, separated from his unit, armed with nothing but a knife and a desperate hope that morning would bring clarity. Back on the English coast, the invasion fleet was already at sea. Eisenhower had made the agonizing decision to proceed, despite the uncertain weather, knowing that any further delay would push the operation back by at least 2 weeks and risk losing the element of surprise entirely. The meteorologists had spotted a brief window of improved conditions, just enough to get the fleet across the channel if everything went exactly right. Standing on the shore watching the ships depart, Eisenhower had already written a statement accepting full responsibility for failure. He kept it in his pocket, hoping he would never need to use it. The channel crossing was brutal even by the standards of soldiers who had trained in rough seas for months. The landing craft, flat-bottomed and designed for capacity rather than comfort, pitched and rolled sickeningly in the swells. Men who had laughed off seasickness in training found themselves helpless, vomiting over the sides or into their helmets. Equipment shifted and crashed with every wave. The noise was overwhelming, the roar of engines, the howl of wind, the constant metallic banging of hulls against waves, and through it all, the knowledge that whatever waited on those beaches could not possibly be worse than this crossing. Corporal Heinrich Weber was 19 years old and had been stationed at a strongpoint overlooking Omaha Beach for 4 months. He was part of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had been recently transferred to Normandy and was considerably more capable than Allied intelligence believed. Weber had grown up in a small village in Bavaria and had been conscripted shortly after his 18th birthday. He had never been in actual combat, but he had trained extensively on the weapons in his bunker, particularly the heavy machine gun, that commanded a sweeping view of the beach below. His sergeant, a veteran of earlier campaigns in the East, had told him that if the Allies ever tried to land here, they would face overwhelming defensive fire on the sand before they could take 10 steps. "You just keep firing," the sergeant had said. "Don't think about anything else. Just keep the trigger pressed and let the weapon do its work." At approximately 6:30 in the morning on June 6th, the first waves of landing craft approached the Normandy beaches. What happened next varied enormously, depending on which beach, which sector, and which unit was involved. At some locations, the defenders had been stunned into ineffectiveness by the massive naval bombardment that preceded the landings. Whole bunkers had been neutralized or abandoned. Minefields had been detonated by explosions that cratered the beach. Soldiers splashed ashore to find only scattered resistance. But at Omaha Beach, everything that could go wrong did. The preliminary bombardment, hampered by low clouds and cautious air crews worried about hitting their own troops, had largely missed the German positions. The specialized tanks designed to provide close support for the infantry had launched too far from shore, and most of them sank in the rough seas, their crews going down with them. The landing craft, fighting strong currents, deposited their human cargo at the wrong locations, mixing units together and ruining carefully rehearsed plans. And Heinrich Weber, along with thousands of other defenders who had survived the bombardment unscathed, began firing. Thomas Mulligan's landing craft hit a sandbar about 70 meters from the waterline. The ramp dropped, and the men in front of him began to move forward. Mulligan was near the back of the boat, which meant he had a moment to see what was waiting for them. The air itself seemed to come alive with danger. The sound was unlike anything he had heard in training, a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Men who had been standing beside him were suddenly gone, fallen into the water or onto the ramp. Mulligan found himself in the surf, his rifle held above his head, wading toward a beach that seemed impossibly far away. Years later, in an interview recorded for a historical archive, Mulligan struggled to describe what those minutes felt like. "Time stopped making sense," he said. "I remember seeing things that should have taken seconds, but they seemed to last forever. A man trying to hold his helmet on while he ran, a piece of equipment floating past me in the water. The sand looked different than I expected, darker somehow, and I just kept moving because stopping meant not making it, and I wasn't ready for that. Not like that. Not on a beach in a country I'd never even seen before." The situation at Omaha was dire, but it was not the whole story. At Utah Beach, a few kilometers to the west, a fortunate accident of currents pushed the landing craft to a section of coast that was far less defended than the intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former American president and himself suffering from a heart condition that should have kept him far from any combat zone, was among the first officers ashore. When his aide pointed out that they had landed in the wrong place, Roosevelt famously replied that they would start the invasion from right here. His calm leadership in those chaotic first minutes helped organize the men who followed him, turning a potential disaster into an unexpected advantage. At the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the specialized armored vehicles that had failed at Omaha performed brilliantly. Tanks that could swim, tanks that laid their own roads, tanks that cleared minefields with chain flails, all the strange inventions that had seemed so impractical in training now justified every hour of their development. Lance Corporal William Barnes of the 3rd British Infantry Division remembered being amazed at the sight of a tank literally building a bridge over a seawall as he watched from behind a concrete obstacle. "I thought I'd seen everything by then," he recalled, "but that was something else entirely. The Germans must have thought we'd brought the whole engineering corps with us." Behind the beaches, the airborne forces were gradually coalescing into something resembling organized units. Despite the chaos of the night drop, small groups of paratroopers had begun to accomplish their objectives through improvisation and sheer stubbornness. At the Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal, a glider-borne force of British soldiers had achieved complete surprise, capturing the vital crossing in the opening minutes of the invasion. The German sentries had been so shocked by the sudden appearance of armed men in the middle of the night that several had surrendered without resistance. The bridge remained intact, and the road to the beaches was blocked to German reinforcements. Field Marshal Rommel was not in Normandy on the morning of June 6th. He had travelled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with senior leadership about reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. When the first reports of the airborne landings reached him, he initially dismissed them as a diversion. The weather was far too poor for a major invasion. The Allies were surely conducting a raid, perhaps a deception operation to mask their real intentions. It was not until nearly noon that Rommel understood the full scope of what was happening and began the long drive back to his headquarters. By then, precious hours had been lost. The confusion at the German High Command mirrored the chaos on the beaches, but worked to the Allies' advantage. Multiple competing chains of command meant that no one person had the authority to respond decisively. The armoured divisions that Rommel had wanted, positioned near the coast, remained locked in their inland positions, awaiting orders that were slow to come. When permission to move was finally granted, Allied aircraft already dominated the skies, making daylight movement extremely dangerous. Tanks that could have reached the beaches by noon were still struggling forward at nightfall, their columns broken by air attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Heinrich Weber survived the day, though he would never forget it. His bunker had held out until early afternoon, when a demolition team finally worked close enough to neutralize it with explosives. Weber and the handful of survivors stumbled out into a world that had been transformed. The beach below was no longer empty sand, but a crowded harbor, with ships and vehicles and men as far as he could see. Equipment was piling up faster than anyone could organize it. The sound of conflict was still audible, but it was distant now, moving inland. Weber was captured without resistance, too exhausted and stunned to even consider fighting. An American soldier handed him a cigarette and pointed toward a group of prisoners being assembled near the waterline. "Over there," the American said in broken German. "The conflict is over for you." The treatment Weber received in the following days would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had been told that the Americans were brutal, that they took no prisoners. That capture meant torture and suffering. Instead, he was fed, given medical attention for a minor wound on his arm, and eventually transported to a camp in England where the conditions, while not comfortable, were far better than anything he had experienced in his own military service. "I kept waiting for the cruelty," he said in a post-war interview. "It never came. They treated us like human beings, even though hours before we had been trying to end each other's efforts. It made me question everything I had been told about our enemies." By nightfall on June 6th, the Allied forces had established footholds on all 5 beaches. The cost had been terrible, particularly at Omaha, where the casualties ran into the thousands. But the Atlantic Wall had been breached. The impossible had happened, and the generals who had sworn it could never happen were left to contemplate the ruins of their certainty. General Friedrich Dollmann's fate would be determined in the weeks that followed. As the Allied forces pushed inland, breaking through the defensive lines he had helped construct, Dollmann found himself increasingly marginalized. The failure to repel the invasion, combined with the subsequent German retreat, ended his reputation. Less than 3 weeks after the landings, Dollmann passed away under circumstances that remain disputed to this day, with some historical accounts suggesting natural causes, and others pointing to different conclusions. His confident prediction that morning had become a monument to the dangers of underestimating an opponent. The invasion's success rested on factors that went far beyond individual bravery, though there was bravery in abundance. The deception operations that had convinced the German leadership that Normandy was a feint and that the real invasion would come at Calais continued to pay dividends for weeks after the landings. Even as Allied forces poured through the Normandy hedgerows, significant German units remained frozen in place around Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The phantom armies, constructed of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, proved as valuable as many real divisions. Marcel Levesque, the French farmer who had watched the paratroopers descend, found his farm transformed into an aid station within days of the landing. American medics set up their equipment in his barn, treating the injured without regard for which uniform they wore. Marcel's wife, Simone, worked alongside them, boiling water and tearing sheets into bandages. Their eldest son, who had been hiding from labor conscription for months, emerged from the cellar where he had been concealed and began helping to dig defensive positions for the soldiers who had liberated his village. "We had prayed for this day for 4 years," Marcel wrote in his diary. "Now that it has come, I find I cannot stop weeping, not from sadness, but from the relief of knowing that the waiting is finally over." The logistics of the invasion continued to astound observers on both sides. Within a week, more than 326,000 troops had crossed the Channel, along with over 50,000 vehicles and more than 100,000 tons of supplies. The Allies had constructed artificial harbors, massive structures made of sunken ships and floating concrete, which allowed them to unload cargo directly onto the beaches without capturing a major port. When German engineers examined these harbors after the conflict, they concluded that the industrial capacity required to build them exceeded anything their own nation could have achieved. The invasion had been won not just by courage, but by factories and shipyards, and the millions of workers who had never seen a beach, but whose labor had made the landings possible. Thomas Mulligan made it off Omaha Beach and survived the subsequent campaign through Normandy and into Germany. He was wounded twice, once seriously enough to earn a trip to a hospital in England, but he returned to his unit both times. In his later years, he rarely spoke about the invasion, except in the most general terms. When his grandchildren asked him what it had been like, he would tell them about the small things: the taste of the salt water, the weight of his pack, the sound his boots made on the sand. He avoided the larger questions about heroism and sacrifice. "We did what we had to do," he would say. "That's all. We did what we had to do." The success at Normandy did not end the conflict in Europe, of course. Nearly a year of hard fighting remained, with setbacks and victories, advances and retreats. But the invasion had accomplished something beyond the military objectives captured on maps. It had proven that the defensive posture adopted by the German forces could be broken, that the industrial and organizational superiority of the Allied powers could be translated into decisive action. The myth of the impregnable fortress had been shattered, and with it, the confidence of a military leadership that had built its strategy on that myth. Private James Dolan, who had spent the first night of the invasion tangled in a tree and hiding in hedgerows, managed to rejoin his unit 3 days after the landing. He served through the rest of the conflict and returned home to Pennsylvania, where he married his high school sweetheart and raised 4 children. He became a high school history teacher, specializing in the very conflict he had helped to win. His students remembered him as a demanding but fair instructor who insisted on precision in dates and names, but who also emphasized the human stories behind the statistics. "History is not just about what happened," he would tell them. "It's about who it happened to and how it changed them. Every number in your textbook represents a person who had a family and hopes and fears, just like you." William Barnes, the British corporal who had marveled at the engineering tanks, remained in the military after the conflict and eventually rose to the rank of major. He spent much of his career working on logistics and supply, convinced by his experiences on the beaches that successful military operations depended as much on organization as on firepower. In his retirement, he wrote a memoir focused not on the dramatic moments of combat, but on the mundane challenges of feeding, clothing, and equipping an army across an ocean. "Everyone wants to hear about the heroes," he wrote in the introduction, "but the real story is about the clerks and the cooks and the truck drivers. Without them, the heroes would have starved on the beaches." The German military leadership's failure to anticipate and respond to the invasion became a subject of intense study in the years that followed. How had they been so wrong? Part of the answer lay in the success of Allied deception, but part also lay in the institutional failures of a command structure that had become rigid and fearful. Subordinates hesitated to report bad news to their superiors. Alternative viewpoints were dismissed as defeatism. The possibility that the enemy might be capable of something unprecedented was simply not considered. The certainty that the beaches could never be taken had become so entrenched that evidence to the contrary was explained away rather than examined. Rommel, who survived the invasion but faced his own fate later that year under circumstances related to internal German politics, had been more right than wrong in his assessment of how the critical day would unfold. The first 24 hours had indeed been decisive. The failure to respond quickly and forcefully in those opening hours had allowed the Allies to establish positions that could not be dislodged. But Rommel's insights had been ignored or overruled by leaders who preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable truths. The beaches of Normandy today bear little resemblance to the intense grounds they became on that June morning. The bunkers have crumbled or been preserved as monuments. The sand has been washed clean countless times by the same tides that the German planners believed would protect them. Visitors walk where soldiers once ran, and children play where men once faced the possibility of their final moments. The cemeteries nearby, row upon row of white markers stretching across green fields, stand as permanent reminders of what the day cost. The story of the invasion has been told countless times, in books and films and documentaries. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects: the bravery, the sacrifice, the planning, the luck. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the contrast between the German general's confident prediction and the reality that followed. "They will never land on these beaches," Dollmann had said, and within hours thousands of men had proved him wrong. The certainty of experts, the logic of military professionals, the analysis of every available factor, all of it had failed to account for the determination of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. The survivors of that day carried their memories differently. Some spoke freely about what they had seen and done. Others locked it away, unable or unwilling to revisit the trauma. Many struggled with the question of why they had lived when so many beside them had not. There were no easy answers, only the ongoing effort to make meaning from chaos and purpose from loss. In the end, the invasion was not won by any single act of heroism or any individual decision. It was won by the accumulated weight of 1,000,000 small actions. A landing craft pilot adjusting his course, a medic dragging a wounded man to cover, an engineer clearing a path through obstacles, a radio operator relaying crucial information under conditions that made communication nearly impossible. It was won by the workers in American factories who built the ships and the British civilians who housed the troops and the French resistance fighters who provided intelligence at the risk of their lives. It was won by everyone who refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. Friedrich Dollmann's words that morning have echoed through the decades, not as a testament to his foolishness, but as a reminder of the limits of certainty. He was not a stupid man. He had access to the best information available. He had studied the problem from every angle, and still he was wrong because he could not imagine an enemy willing to attempt what reason said could not be done. The beaches proved him wrong not through any failure of logic, but through the irreducible factor of human will, the refusal of those soldiers in their pitching landing craft to accept that the odds against them were too great. The dawn that rose over Normandy on June 7th revealed a transformed coastline. Ships crowded the anchorages. Men and machines moved inland along roads that had been quiet for years. The locals emerged cautiously from their shelters, uncertain what this new reality would mean for them, but sensing that the long occupation was finally ending. The conflict would continue, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The beaches had been taken. The wall had been breached. And the confident prediction of a general who believed he understood his enemy had been buried beneath the weight of history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.